Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all here today. Thank you very much for coming. My name
Your Excellency Paul Larsen, Ambassador for Norway to New Zealand, distinguished guests, and I include you, Consul General for Norway, resident in Wellington, Graham Mitchell. I greet you all, including former President of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, Sir Ken Keith. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another Institute of International Affairs meeting. Our two countries, Norway and New Zealand, bear quite a remarkable number of similarities. Both are maritime nations, and in terms of terrain, both countries know glaciers, fjords, and green expanses. In terms of governance, both countries are democracies, and the head of state is either a king or queen, constitutionally so in the case of Norway. Operationally, both are welfare states with many other congruences regarding energy and awareness of climate change. There are many things in which Norway has a considerable head start, and that gives a kind of entree to what we're going to be interested to learn from you, Excellency. Our speaker is a senior diplomat in Norway's Foreign Service, in which he has been for nearly 30 years. He's a graduate in both science and arts, and he's undertaken postings in many important capitals, Belgrade and Moscow, as well as the United Nations and the United States of America. You took up your office late last year and presented credentials to the Governor-General, Dame Patsy Reddy, in January. You've already been to New Zealand twice, and it's good to know that you are going to be a regular visitor, because I've noted that we have to share you with not only Australia, but at least 10 other Pacific states. You should know, Your Excellency, that you are welcome here, and we look forward to hearing from you. The catchy title, "Can we take on Norway in the electric vehicle stakes?" provides a kind of answer to the terrain that you will cover. You are assured, sir, of our interest. I welcome you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President and Melanie, for inviting, and the Institute for inviting me here and for making me into some kind of expert on electric vehicle sales, which of course I am not. I'm a mere diplomat. So what I will try to do is to make a connection between our foreign policy, our place in the world, and the electric cars towards the end of my presentation. It's great to be here in New Zealand as ambassador. It's probably the best job in the world that I could imagine. Beautiful people, beautiful nature, many similarities, as the President said, population-wise, same, 5 million people. We are a little bit larger than you, and then we are located at exactly the opposite end of the world. And if you put a stick right through the center of the earth from Norway, you end up basically just outside the coast of New Zealand. So we are really on the opposite sides of the world. But we have many similarities. Sadly, of course, we also have now in common having suffered a traumatic terrorist attack from right-wing extremists. We suffered through this 8 years ago in 2011, and now you, our King, our Prime Minister, have conveyed our deepest sympathy and condolences to our friends here in New Zealand on behalf of the people of Norway, and we know only too well how you feel. I will offer my then take on Norway from our foreign policy perspective, our place in the global political economy, including the very hot topics of climate and energy and electric cars as part of the sustainable development goals and the global picture we see on global common goods and common interests. And then I leave it to you to ask the question or answer it, maybe ask of me if we have some time at the end, how New Zealand can take on Norway, as this popular advertisement says. Now, first let me say that Norway and New Zealand are certainly not competitors, but very close collaborators in international affairs. We work together, we even sit together in the United Nations next to each other in the alphabet. We talk the same language, literally, English of course. We speak that in Norway almost as well as we speak Norwegian, or sometimes even better. We also speak the political same language to a very, very large or almost identical extent. We work together in the WTO for free trade, open trade, and of course in the United Nations for international law and the rules-based system, which has served both of our nations and all small and big states in world politics so well for 70 years, but which is really now under stress from protectionism and populism and nationalism, including in some of the bigger states or the major powers that also benefit from this system. And this is one of the major megatrends that we see as most worrying in the world today. And we discussed this with our New Zealand colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs yesterday. We had our diplomatic consultations, which we don't have as often as we would like because of the distance, but it's compensated by the fact that we keep meeting in multilateral arenas, and especially in New York, where I spent 6 years myself with the United Nations delegation there. Of course, we are similar, but it's not to say that we are not different or that we have nothing to learn from each other. We do, and it goes both ways. I recall, for example, when I started my foreign service, finished my education in London, School of Economics in 1989, that you had major market and financial reforms during those years that our central bank and our finance ministry and politicians learned a lot from. We had our own banking crisis, property boom and bust in those years. We nationalized, basically. We bought up the banks. We bailed in, not out. And we recovered after that. But those years have been, of course, very exciting years, those 30 years since the Cold War ended, since the first thing that happened when I joined the foreign ministry was that the Berlin Wall came down. And the first thing happened when I came to my first post in Yugoslavia was that the war broke out. And when I left that one country, it was 5 countries after 3 years of being posted in Belgrade. And we had big changes, and let's lead into this. The global picture of Norwegian foreign policy is very much conditioned by a few factors, a few circles. And one is, of course, the fact that we are a neighbor with Russia. You cannot actually see it on this map, but we have a small 200-kilometer border just north of Finland there, directly with Russia. And, of course, Russia is not a threat we don't see Russia as a threat to Norway, but it is a strategic challenge to NATO and to the Western world now, in a way that was not the case after the Berlin Wall came down, and Russia actually, during the 1990s, really became a partner in the United Nations, but even with NATO. We had military-to-military cooperation. We had very positive business collaboration. When I spent 5 years in Russia during the 2000s, there was enormous growth in interest in people-to-people contacts, in business contacts, and it culminated with finally agreeing our maritime border, which you also cannot see well here, but we had a 40-year negotiation going with the Russians to agree on where was the maritime border. Since the law of the sea regimes were established in the 1980s, and before that there were disagreements about where we should draw the line. But there was a common interest in the 2000s. How do we have a clear separation so that we could start looking at developing the resources in the Barents Sea, in addition to the fishing resources that we maintain there. So in 2010 we concluded, we signed, and after that, unfortunately, the relations with Russia have deteriorated, especially following Russia's annexation of the Crimea and what we see as breaches of international law in the Ukraine, and following all Western countries with sanctions which are still in place and which, of course, hamper our relations and possibilities for broad and deep cooperation with Russia. But at the same time, I have to say, we maintain constructive neighborly cooperation especially on fishing resources. These are the last remaining codfish resources in the Atlantic, since the Canadian resources were depleted and never recovered in the early 90s. We have managed, together with the Russians, to set quotas to maintain stocks, sustainable management of those fishing resources, to the point when, of course, together with salmon aquaculture, fish is now our second biggest export earner from Norway. The second dimension of our foreign policy is, as I mentioned, NATO. We joined NATO, Norway. It's exactly 70 years ago, 2 days from now. On 4th of April, the treaty was signed, North Atlantic Treaty, in Washington, 12 nations, including Norway. There was a big, and I know I'm mentioning this because I know you had similar debates about the alliance with the United States here in this country for the last, 30 years or more. You tell me, but there was a big split in the governing Labour Party at the time. There were many who felt that Russia wasn't really, or Soviet Union wasn't really such a big threat. We had seen that the Soviets basically liberated the northern part of Norway from Nazi occupation in 1944, and we're going to mark that with a nice celebration this autumn in the extreme north of Norway. And they pulled back peacefully after driving the Nazis out. So at the same time, the Labour Party, which is a socialist, social democratic party, also felt that there was a risk of aligning too closely with the United States and the capitalist system. But it tipped, the balance was tipped when the Soviets started intervening heavily in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia and other countries, and the party and the government and the parliament decided to join NATO, and we never really looked back in the 70 years since then. NATO has preserved political unity, peace in Europe ever since. It has provided crucial security guarantees for Norway by linking the transatlantic, the United States, to the defense and security of of Europe, and in particular, of course, those of us that are bordering the big power, the big neighbor in the east. And that's, of course, why we have been concerned about signals from Washington about, from the administration, the new administration, about NATO. But we also believe that when we look at what's happening on the ground with the deployment of US and NATO troops in the Baltic states, that it doesn't help if I point because you cannot see, but anyway, you know where the Baltic states are south of Finland there. We have deployments there now to provide a kind of strong sign of commitment from US and NATO towards the defense of the territories of the new member states in accordance with what we call Article 5, which is the collective defense agreement. One for all for one. And of course, in the 70 years, NATO has had a lot of evolution. Since the Cold War, a lot of peacekeeping, thousands, tens of thousands of peacekeepers supporting UN operations in the Balkans. And then the so-called humanitarian intervention against Serbia in 1999, followed by the Afghanistan counterterrorism operations in the 2000s. And then today, in a way, back towards focus on territorial defense. And of course, the Trump administration very focused on the 2% of GDP goal that NATO countries have committed to spend on defense. We are working towards that goal. Very few nations have managed to reach that target. And Australia, of course, not a member of NATO, they have reached the target on their own right. I'm not sure how the figures are here in New Zealand, but I would be interested in hearing. In any case, there is a feeling now that NATO is well and alive, and partly, let's say, as The Economist wrote last week, thanks to Putin and Russia for providing NATO with a continued rationale beyond peacekeeping and international operations. As you can see from the map, we are very much a European country, and the third dimension of our policy is Europe. Which our relations with the European Union are very interesting. Of course, they are primarily economic, because we are not a member of the European Union. But we are as close as you can be without being a full member and without sitting at the table in Brussels. We sit on the corridor, we wait for the others to come out. Our people said no twice to join by a margin of 2%, 51-49 in 1972, and then again in 1994. And I remember it well because our Swedish and Finnish neighbors and the Austrians all decided to join. They had referendums in 1994. And we had sequenced those referendums so that Norway came last, because we knew that the Norwegian public was the most skeptical. And if the Norwegians saw that all our neighbors and everyone else wanted to be part of the European Union, then we thought we would, let's say, win, because most of our diplomats, we would like to be a member of the European Union. But it was not to be. The people voted 51% no. So then the solution was what they now voted down again in the British Parliament this morning. The so-called Norway option, Norway plus option, or minus, I don't know exactly. They hooked on the customs union onto this, what they now call Common Market 2.0, which includes both full integration with all the four freedoms, goods, services, capital, and labor, which we have, full single market integration, so that our businesses have exactly the same standards and full access to the European market, which is our, of course, way biggest export market. But the British also hooked on the customs union, which we don't have because we want to protect our farmers and fishermen, farmers are unprofitable and the fishermen are very profitable. And the fishing grounds are very large, so this is not part of our agreement with the European Union, which of course mean that we can also enter into, and will probably enter into, free trade agreements with New Zealand and Australia in due course when New Zealand and Australia have finished their negotiations, your negotiations with the European Union on free trade agreements. But we are, again, as close as can be. We are friends with the benefits, let's say. We are the closest partner you can be outside the European Union. And we also actually member of Schengen. So if you want to go to any European country and can convince the embassy that you will stay a bit longer in Norway than anywhere else, you can apply for visa for the whole Europe in our embassy. This is not that we're inviting people to come, because we have a very small embassy in Canberra and only 2 people dealing with 1,000 visas a year. But I know that some people who see long queues at the French embassy, they come to us. And this leads me on to the 4th dimension. But first, just to mention, and now we're getting to the climate and energy things, which the Institute is very keen on me talking about, and I'm happy to do, because Norway is the second biggest supplier of, we are the big energy producer in Europe, except for Russia, of course. They are huge. They supply 1/3 of the natural gas that European Union needs. We supply 1/4. The rest comes from North Africa and Algeria, etc. So 1/4 comes from Norway through pipelines. It's all pipelines. It's not liquid gas like Australia is now a huge liquid gas exporter, but we are pipeline. Liquid is, LNG is very small. It's not necessary from Norway. We have the pipelines we need to UK, to Germany, to reaching all over the continent. So we are the energy, and we are also the battery of Europe, because since we became independent from Sweden in 1905, we have developed massive hydro power, which I think you also have. You have 80% of your electricity from hydropower. We have 96% of our electricity comes from hydropower. And this is, of course, a big difference with our friends in Australia, where 2/3 is from coal. That means we also export electricity now, increasingly, to Europe. So the energy relations with Norway and Europe are extremely strong. And then now we're coming into the 4th dimension, which is the global sustainable development, United Nations dimension. Well, there are 3 important things with the United Nations. I spent 20 years of my 30 years within the United Nations. And now we are campaigning to be member of the Security Council, which is the first important thing with the United Nations. New Zealand was member a few years ago, and I was campaign manager. I came here the first time 3 years ago to speak to the diplomats who were dealing with the campaign very successfully at the time. And I have to say we learned a lot, and we have taken on board all those lessons in our own campaign. Hopefully we will be elected to the Security Council again next year. But we have tough competition against Ireland and Canada for 2 seats. So it's tough, but that's why traveling in the South Pacific is also very important for me. Every state has 1 vote. Tonga has the same vote as the United States in the United Nations. The Security Council is extremely important, regardless of whether you are a member or not. But I don't know, I would like to hear from you afterwards if you felt, which I think we have heard and we saw, that New Zealand's stature and status in the world increased while you were a member of the Council, and probably and surely also beyond that, because it really brings a new dimension and credibility to your diplomacy and your place in the world, dealing with and shaping international law, sanctions, peacekeeping missions, and conflict resolution. The second important thing with the United Nations is the fact that it creates international law, of course the Security Council, but also the General Assembly, the Law of the Sea conventions, in particular important for us, for you, for New Zealand, Norway, other ocean states. As you know, we have had the 200-mile economic zones since 1982, including also continental shelves. And of course, when you look at now, so one can go back, sorry, just wanted to show, and we're getting there. This is Norwegian continental shelf, and these are oil licenses, the colors, you see there, 200-mile zone. So half of our exports are oil and gas, and the rest is fish. So the law of the sea, the sovereignty of the seas and the continental shelves would flow from that, and which is protected by international law, is extremely important for us. And that's where that's United Nations. The third thing is, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. We are coming to the climate and energy, because now we are talking about all aspects of sustainable development. Of course, the traditional development, health, education, good governance, gender equality, remains very important. Norway, we have actually a parliament that demands of the government to spend 1% of our GDP on foreign aid, foreign assistance, which basically amounts to about $6 billion a year from Norway. I don't know exactly your budget. I know the Australian one. And it's about $1,000 per capita, more than $1,000 per capita. So most of it is still going very much towards poverty. But what we have done in the last few years is to increase assistance towards protecting global common goods. And there are basically two. That's climate and that's oceans. And on oceans, we have, that's a recent thing. I was privileged to be part of actually the coordinator for the Sustainable Development Goals follow-up of Norway as we presented our first report, voluntary report to United Nations in 2016, the year after the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And the oceans, there was a goal on oceans which had never been there in the Millennium Development Goals. There was no oceans focus there. There were environmental focus in the Millennium Development Goals, which were the predecessor for the Sustainable Development Goals, but there was nothing on oceans. So the number 14, which is oceans, extremely important, and now we're taking a lead together with other countries, including New Zealand, and focusing on marine plastic pollution, reducing, hello, bonjour, bonsoir, marine plastic pollution. We have established, the Prime Minister of Norway is the co-chair of the Secretary General Guterres advocacy group for the Sustainable Development Goals. So she's traveling around and promoting the Sustainable Development Goals across the world. So she's established a panel, a high-level panel, particularly focused on sustainable oceans economy. And we're having a big conference in Oslo this autumn on our oceans. On climate, we started about 10 years ago to provide huge funding to protect tropical forests in developing countries. And we're talking about Guyana, where half of the country is, they are keeping that protected in return for payment. The same in Brazil. It's difficult because, of course, there's many interests in logging, but we are working with these governments, Liberia, also in the Congo, Indonesia, and even in Papua New Guinea, we are setting aside, how much is it? About $1 billion a year almost, or a bit less, towards these programs. We also do quite a lot on renewable energy, including in the South Pacific. They have diesel aggregates. We're going through organizations, UN and others, that are replacing this with solar, providing money for that. And then, of course, the Paris Agreement. And, of course, one reason why we are doing all these things is to help the climate. And obviously then we are in a dilemma, but we are in a situation where our own people, our youth, our school kids, we had a school strike in Norway just a couple of weeks ago, like I think you had here, and I was actually in Perth when it happened in Australia. Even there was a school strike. And kids criticize us for being an oil exporter, oil producer, petroleum producer. And yes, one thing that we can say then, it's true, but we are doing as much as we can to provide assistance internationally for whether it's forest protection, so-called carbon sink, you can call it, but it's also about biodiversity, of course. Renewable energy, providing Europe, even though if you are hardline green, of course, you don't accept this argument that natural gas is better than coal, but it is better than coal. I mean, there's half the emissions from natural gas electricity than from coal-fired power plants. And one of the reasons that the UK has managed to reduce their emissions of CO2 by 40%, I mean, the main reason is actually import of natural gas and electricity now from Norway. So we are helping others reduce their emissions, and we have set an extremely ambitious, I would say, but this is ambitious target under the Paris Agreement, which we are 100% committed to, of reducing our own emissions nationally by 40%, or 45% even was mentioned recently, by 2030. We are now negotiating with, or we have proposed to the European Union to do this formally together with them. We anyway would do it with the European Union and their quota system, which covers half of their emissions. But of course, in the transport sector and agriculture and other sectors, it's not part of the quota system. And that's where the big challenge comes in. And that's where the electric cars come in, because we see that transport sector is a big contributor to CO2 emissions, and that there is something we can do about that. And whether you can take on Norway or not, it's so interesting. I don't know if you followed the Labour Party in Australia's plan announced yesterday for similar cuts by 2030 of 45% in Australian emissions. And a target of 50%, Bill Shorten said 50% new cars by 2030 should be electric. We are almost there now. 40% of cars sold in Norway last year were electric cars, new cars, 40%. And the aim is to have all cars by 2025. And people buy up on electric cars. Of course, charging stations are very important. And that's one thing that Bill Shorten was talking about yesterday as a problem in Australia. That's why they're putting money forward for that, or proposing to do that. We have done that quite a lot. But of course, it helps when the starting point is that a petrol car, since time immemorial, as long as I can remember, petrol cars have cost double in Norway as they do in Belgium, for example. The taxes on petrol cars in Norway are on almost 100%. It depends on the make, and some French smaller cars are a little bit less expensive, but the big ones are more expensive. So that if you, for example, that's why Norway is the second biggest market for Teslas in the world. In absolute terms, we have 5 million people, and we are only behind the Americans in buying Teslas. And that's because people have money in around Oslo. If you want a similar petrol car, it costs double. Tesla costs 100,000, and Audi A5 costs 200,000. So you're also environmentally conscious. You buy a Tesla. And then, in addition, you have no toll roads, because that's another thing. It's expensive to drive in and out of Oslo. The tolls are at least $5 each time you pass in and out. If you live outside Oslo, it amounts to a lot of money. Not for electric cars. Third, and most important for many people, you can use the collective lane where the buses go. So while Renaults and others without electric sit in the queues, because there are big queues into Oslo in the morning, the Teslas whoosh past, waving to the petrol drivers. So that's a big incentive also for buying electric cars. Plus, you have also free parking mostly free parking in town and free charging. In addition to that, Tesla has put up, and the government is helping to put up charging stations in the mountains along the road so that you can actually drive a bit further, and the batteries are getting better. So I think we might even reach that target of 100% renewable cars by 2025. That is the aim of the government. And in Oslo, they are making it also very difficult to drive in the center, and they have an aim of having the whole center car-free by 2025. Big aims, but electric cars are then an important part of the solution that we see for reaching those 45% goals. Now, at the same time, just to round off, I see that the President is looking at the watch, but I hope I can speak for 5 more minutes. Melanie, you gave me till past, didn't you? Yes. So, at the same time, of course, we are exporting oil and gas, and the IEA, the International Energy Agency, says that we need, there will be a growth in consumption and demand by at least 1 million barrels a day, and now it's about 100, it's almost 100 million barrels a day now, and it will just grow because of India and China and developing countries want also petrol to power their electricity and economies. Of course, we're also very proud of our oil platforms. This is the biggest concrete platform ever. It's many years ago already, 25 years ago, this was towed out to one of the fields which is still producing oil and gas for Europe, France included, Germany. Although France is actually, they have a lot of other power sources, so there's less import maybe there, but still quite large. Here's the southern part of the continental shelf. You see, we have oil and gas for another 50 or 100 years. We've been producing for at least 50 years this year. We found oil in this part of the sea, Christmas Eve, 1969. And thanks to the Danish, who we had the discussions with them about the demarcation of the sea borders, and apparently one late night after a few drinks, the Danish foreign minister became very flexible and said, let's draw the line here. And then a few years later, we found the biggest oil field ever right there. So thanks to the Danes. But they occupied us for 400 years, so it was a little bit of payback time for us. And they are still our very good friends and good neighbors. And they say we have an oil for another 50 years and gas for maybe 100 years. And whether this will be assets that will be stranded as a result of renewables, we can hope so for the sake of the climate. But for Norway, of course, it's a huge challenge if the world moves away from oil and gas. We have managed to build a pension fund for a future fund, they call it in Australia. It's much smaller, but we have, ours is about $1 trillion now. And more than half is now coming from financial revenue. Half of it is from oil revenue still going straight into the fund every year. There's nothing going straight into the budget. Everything goes straight into the fund. Of course, we are relying on this for our wealth and our future and our pensions. But at the same time, young people and others are saying we have to prepare for the future, we have to cut production. We are limiting production and new fields in the north, where there are vulnerable areas for fish and like here, for example. So it's not a free-for-all, but we have decided to continue. Of course, we cannot just cut this. Happiness was a question, I think, in the invitation. Why is Norway so happy, and can New Zealand be equally happy? I just note that Norway and Scandinavia are always on top of these happiness indexes. And I will round off with this. And I also ask myself why. I mean, I'm happy, but I don't see that Norwegians are particularly more happy than other Europeans, although sometimes you feel that maybe the French or the Italians are complaining more. Of course, it helps that you have a very good economy, a high level of wealth, high level of equality and social justice, gender equality, but also social equality. I think that really helps people to not be envious and jealous, although social media doesn't help the other direction, I would have to say. The fact that you have security, okay, we are neighbors with Russia, but it's not seen as a big threat. It's a challenge, but it's not a threat. People feel secure. There's freedom of expression, freedom of religion. I mean, there's a lot of freedom and security in the society. I think that there's a lot of trust in the society. People trust each other. There's very little corruption, nothing on the central level, some maybe here and there on the local level, but in general, the lowest levels of corruption you can imagine. Good governance, all these things make people quite happy. And there's the outdoors, nature. I think maybe the main factor is that we have low expectations. So that we have lived through hard times, poverty, hard climate, tough long winters, 7 months of snow, even in Oslo, then a little bit of sunshine, a little bit of warm makes you quite easily quite happy. And I think that actually this Protestant, prudent, kind of low expectations culture in Scandinavian countries is one reason why people report, because that's how happiness is measured, by people's reporting. Are you happy? Yes. I do think, though, that what I see now, this concern about climate change among many people, is creating worries. Young people, I remember when I was young, in the 70s, people, not me, but many people were very concerned about nuclear war. It's almost the same now. I have the sense that, and then an additional final point, which really concerns me also as a nature lover, now you see a clash between climate change fighters, or people who fight against climate change, and potentially a clash with environmentalists, because there is now, they say that if we are going to reach these Paris goals, we have to build up much more renewable power. And there is no more to do on the hydropower front. We had huge civil disobedience and demonstrations in the 70s already for building dams and ruining, because it does ruin the nature. We know that. Now the question is windmills on land, and huge, these windmills in nature. And it was only yesterday that this debate again erupted when the directorate proposed 13 new areas for building windmills. And of course, if you have to build windmills and ruin nature in order to meet the Paris goals, then you have a very sad, difficult dilemma that will make not people very, very happy, I think. So, but you have similar issues here. I would like to hear from you, or happy to answer any questions you may have in the next half hour. I managed to finish by the time allotted, so thank you for your attention.